Welcome. For this part of the tutorial, we are going to talk about the volume builder some more, but first we need to introduce something called fields. And to do that, we're actually going to use the cloner, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to show you another way that you can use the cloner and something called an effector in order to change the position of objects. And so let's go ahead and get started with that. So we're going to create a cube. I'm going to hit H so I'm somewhat framed in on there. And this cube, if you're in centimeters mode, it's going to be 200 by 200 by 200. In millimeters, it's 2000 by 2000 by 2000. So I'm going to make it 1500 by 100 by 1500. And then once I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead and create a cloner, right? The white thing with the green dots. And I'm going to go ahead and make the cube a child of that cloner. And then I'm going to select my cloner. I'm going to make sure I'm on the Object tab. And down where it says Count 3, 1, 3, right? If you remember, this is the grid array. And so, right, it's 3 by 3 and then one set of tiles tall. But I'm going to make it 25 by 1 by 25. And I'm going to zoom out, or I'm going to hit H on the keyboard so I can frame that whole thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to use something called an effector that's going to allow us to individually position each one of these clones separately, right? So they don't have to remain a tile. They don't all have to be rotated at the same angle. And then we're going to use a field in order to isolate that effect to one part of this grid of things. And so with the cloner, one of the things we can do is we can use what are called effectors. And to use an effector, what we need to do is we need to go up to the top of the screen where it says MoGraph. Click on that MoGraph menu. The first thing is effector. Notice the cloner is here, and there's several other MoGraph objects we can use, or generators as they're called. And so I'm going to go ahead to effector. And for this one, I'm going to start by just using the shader effector because it's a pretty simple way to show some of the things that you can do with this. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the shader. You'll notice this already looks different. You'll notice the shader effector is its own object in the hierarchy. However, if I click on my cloner and I go over to effectors, you'll see that the shader effector is visible there, right? And you'll notice there is this 100% option here, which allows me to adjust how much of an effect this is having on there in just one place if I want to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our shader. We're going to click on our shader, and the tabs we're going to be interested in are the parameter tabs and the shading tab for right now. And then we'll talk about fall off in just a little bit. So for the parameter tab, right, the reason this looks weird is because right now it's set to transform the scale by half. And so it's basically making these all 1.5 times as large. So they're intersecting. So let's just uncheck that. And to start with, we're just going to be working with position. So we're going to turn position on. And I'm going to set the Y position to 700, or if you're in centimeters, 70. And you'll notice when I did that, it jumped up a little bit in the Y direction, and the whole thing did it because currently we're impacting the entire thing. But the way the shader effector works is it uses a black and white or a grayscale image, and it can do color as well. But usually it only does one color channel or uses alpha in order to say which of these are being adjusted and by how much. And so I'm going to go to my shading, and under the shader, I'm going to go ahead and choose gradient to start with. And as soon as I do that, you'll notice that there's a slight change. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I want to have the white in my shader. Now you'll notice, like you can see as I'm moving this, I am getting a little bit of adjustment here. And so we'll look at making that a little bit stronger here in a second. So I've got this centered. I'm going to go ahead and drop another point here, and then I'm going to set that to black, right? And then I'm going to go ahead and pull these in a little bit so there's a bit more deliberate lift in the middle of this. I'm going to go ahead and rotate my view. And you can see that it's very slightly raising up. So I'm going to go back to my shader. And I'm going to go to parameters. And you'll see that I have this set to 700 millimeters. If I continue to increase that, you'll see that it continues to rise higher and higher. So if I was to set this right to, let's just say, I think 10,000, there we go, right? In your case, if it would be 1,000 if you're working in centimeters, right? So now I have this nice curved shape of clones, right, that are following. If I go back to my shading and click on the gradient shader, right, it's following this. So if I was to make adjustments here, right, I could change the shape of this. I could have that drop pretty quickly, right? There's lots of ways I could change it here. Okay, so let's look at what some of the other settings are real quick. So if I go back to the parameter tab on my shader, then I can also turn on rotation. And if I'm rotating in the P orientation, you can see that what's happening is, right, the tiles start out flat and then they slowly curl up until that peak moment, and then they descend back to a flat position. So this is great, but let's say that I only want this to happen in a certain way, or let's actually make a couple changes. Let's go back to our shading and let's make this, instead of a gradient, we're going to leave it a gradient, but instead of the type being 2D V, we're going to do circular or radial. No, radial isn't what we want. We probably want circular. Okay, so we're going to do circular. And you'll see that it really doesn't make that big of a difference on the shape of this, unfortunately. Part of that may be because I have this center point. Let's get rid of that. Let's pull this up. All right, so something I want you to notice is that it isn't applying it evenly to the entire surface, right? It's not applying it as though, you know, as this gradient is set up. Let me see if I can pull this in a little bit more. Right, but it's doing it in, right, it's only doing it along one axis. Now, why is that? Right, and that's because the only direction I'm telling it to make a manipulation in is in the Y direction. So, right, so I'm going to go ahead and, I want this to be a pretty obvious deformation here, right? So I've got this set in this direction. Let's go back to our shader. And let's go to our parameters. And, right, so let's go ahead and say, okay, in the Y, we're doing 1,000 or 10,000. Let's do 1,000 in the X, 1,000 in the Z. You can see that maybe if I make these 10, it'll be more apparent what's happening. Right, so it's still pushing it, but it's only pushing them in one direction, right? Like the Z pushes it this way. If I was to set the Z back to 0, you'll see that that nudges back over. If I set the X to, I don't know, 20,000, right, you can see that it, again, is pushing these over a little bit, and you can see they're kind of clustering up here. Oops, I set the Y to 3 somehow. There we go. Right, but it's not doing like a round, right? What I'd like is for some of these in the center to be lifted, but none of the ones around the outside edges. So I'm going to set my X to 0 again. I'm really just going to focus on lifting these up right now. And somehow, I even failed at that. Okay. All right, so I've got these lifting up. I have the angle set as well. I'm going to turn rotation off for the time being. Right, and so I've got these set. Something else that might be nice, however, is scale. And rather than adjusting uniform scale, let's just scale them in the Y direction by like 2. No, let's do it by 20. Okay, let's do it by 200. There we go. Right, so this gives us a little bit more volume on our shapes, and it should make it a little easier to see what's happening. So the next thing is, where do fields come into this? Fields come in that they shrink or isolate the impact of a certain effect. And so if I go to my cloner, if I go to my shader and I click on fall off, this whole thing in fall off says field, and there's this linear field, a solid, this clamp. You can actually add masks. If I click and hold on the linear field, you'll see that there's a lot of other possible fields in here, including you may have noticed, a shader field. If I go to this purple line pointing to another purple line, that is the linear field. And if I click on that, you'll see that there are, again, all of those same fields are available. Right, so let's start with a linear field. So we're going to apply a linear field to this. Now you'll see already the impact of that linear field. The linear field works by saying it essentially creates a gradient from, and it's hard to see because it's so small. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here and checkmark click to shape, which should be, well, it should have made it bigger, but it didn't. But so if I zoom in a bit, you'll see that there's these two purple planes in there, which might be hard to see with the model. Maybe I can hide my cloner temporarily. There we go. All right, so there's these two purple planes, and each one of these planes, it creates like a gradient from no effect on one side of the plane to full effect on the other side of the plane, and then a gradient between those two. So if you have these planes close together, that transition's very quick. If you have the planes further apart, it's a slower transition. So let's go ahead and turn that cloner back on. And for some reason, it decided to shape it to that shape. So let's see if I can, it doesn't really matter. It'll work still. All right, so what I can do is if I select my linear field, I can click on these parts, and you'll see that, right, by stretching these out, I'm increasing the range from no effect to an effect. And if I move this field, right, then the effect is full, and I can slide across to where that essentially disappears. All right, so this is one of the ways that I can use fields, right? And this is just a linear field. It doesn't have to be oriented straight. If I go to rotate it, right, I can rotate this so it has an effect here. And fields are like layers in that you can blend them together. So I've got one linear field here. If I was to go ahead and if I was to select my cloner again and create another linear field, then when I go back to my shader, oops, hold on. Sorry, if I select my shader and I create another linear field by clicking on this button here, you'll see that the two linear fields interact with one another, right? So you can see that this field doesn't care what's going on. It's going to overlap it, but I can have those two, and you'll see that there's these blending modes. There's max, subtract, overlay. There's all sorts of ways that we can use these to create really interesting and really complex sets of clones and effects, etc. Right? And these are also things that we can use on the a volume. We can do all of this in 3 dimensions. So one other type of field, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to uncheck both of those so they're not visible. Another field that we can use here is the spherical field, right? And the sphere is absolutely tiny. So if I pull this out some, right, you can see that now I'm getting this nice, right, sphere of influence on this. And if I raise this up, I can have it, you can see how I can do this. And you can imagine how this would be great for animation, not just modeling. So I've got my sphere here. And currently we've just been dealing with scale and position, right? We're lifting these up and scaling them. if I was to go back to my parameters and turn rotation on, right, you can see that the sphere is also controlling how these objects are rotating as well. So, right, so this is what fields are, and this is what fields do. So let's go ahead and take what we've learned and apply this to a volume. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new scene. And in this new scene, I'm going to go ahead and create a volume. I'm going to use a torus. And to be my base object, I'm going to create a volume builder. I'm going to drop the torus in as a child of the volume builder. And then I'm going to grab a random field. Now, I could use any, but this one in particular, there's a reason why we're using this. And I'm going to make this also a child of the volume builder. Now, when you do that, you'll see that right now we're getting something strange. So I'm going to go ahead and add a volume mesher to this to make it a little easier to see what's going on. Right, so the random field created this weird noisy cube object, and then I also have my torus, right? And if I move the order of these, it doesn't really make any difference in terms of what's going on. The random field has all of these little dots that allow me to control kind of the random seed value of the noise and where it is. I can scale the whole thing as well. But in this case, I'm going to leave it at its full size. Now, with this, as a sign distance field, right, it's currently, the random field is uniting with the torus. Now, I could subtract the random field from the torus, right, but I'm still going to get this, you know, and maybe that's a nice way to get some interesting surface texture. But it's not really what I'm looking for. What I'm trying to do is I want this random field to be inside, to actually make the torus porous, which is a great thing to say quickly 3 times fast. Torus porous. Okay, so we don't want this mode. What we want to do is we want to change the sign distance field to fog. And once we change this to fog, we might actually need to either make the torus bigger or make the random field a little bit bigger. Let's see if either of those things will help. No, it seems to be messing with it right now. Okay, so let's go back to our volume builder. And so you'll see the random field is set to normal. Let's see what happens as we go through here and switch these different modes. So max changes things a little bit. Minimum is what we're looking for, but let's go ahead and look at these other ones. Add, right? Add allows us to have a cohesive object, but it's giving us somewhat rough texture on the outside. Subtract, again, similarly, it's subtracting some from that stuff. If we go ahead and make our voxel size smaller, we're going to have a much different effect, just as a heads up. So, right, so now you can see that my voxel size is smaller, and now I'm getting this subtract, and it's actually creating a really interesting shape. If I go to normal, right, again, you'll see that it's basically normal, but you can see a lot more of that noise detail in there. If I go to multiply, right, multiply is one of the options that may work well. You'll notice that it is cutting off the edges of our torus, and so we would either have to make our torus smaller or potentially make the random field larger, which I don't know if that actually makes any changes. Yeah, you can see that even as I scale this up, right, I'm actually getting more space in the noise, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it's not scaling here, so, you know, so we're scaling the noise, but we're not scaling the object. If we go to our volume builder, however, we scale that up, right? It's also scaling the object, but not scaling our thing. So one option with using multiply would be to actually just scale down the size of our torus. All right, so now that I've scaled this torus down, and I have it set to multiply, right, and I might want this just to be a little fatter. You can see I'm still shrinking to the edges here. Right? So now I've got this really, really porous object that basically conforms to the dimensions of this torus. Now there's a bunch of other settings that we can use in here to clean this up some and make it a little bit nicer looking. So first, right, our noise currently, I've been scaling that up. We could either set that back to 1, right? If I need more detailed noise, I can set that to, say, 0.4, 0.4, and 0.4. Right, so now I have significantly more tightly detailed noise in there. And so, let's see here. Let's click on our volume builder and go to our object tab. Right, and so that's multiply. The other option is subtract, which, oops, not subtract. Sorry, subtract is not max, but min. Right, so min is another option that allows us to have this noise encapsulated inside our object, our torus. And so something else we can do with this is now that if I want to scale this up, right, I still hit these boundaries, right? So we just have to be aware of the boundaries of the outer object. Okay, so I've got this set. So then let's go ahead and look at what happens when we start to add some different filters onto this. Now, additionally, before we do that, right, the volume mesher, we can have we can really control how porous or broken up this noise is based on our voxel threshold, right? So we can come in here and you can actually get a lightly pockmarked surface, or you can have it be just a whole bunch of particles, this real like a fog or a cloud of particles that are oddly shaped floating around in space. So let's put this back to 50%. We'll just be back to normal. Adaptive is going to do something similar, but it doesn't really make a big difference. So let's go and add some smoothing. So fog smooth, if we smooth it all the way, it gets really, really smooth. So let's go ahead and select our filter tab, and let's go ahead and adjust that smoothness. Right, and so as I pull this smoothing down, right, I'm going to get more or less detail. Now this gives me a really fine level of control with how I do this. Right? If I go to mean instead and increase this some, right, that gives me basically a little bit finer control in terms of some of that fine detail. You'll notice that if I increase or decrease voxel distance or the number of iterations, right, I get either more or less smoothing. It's basically all like really nice ways to fine tune what I'm doing. If I go to median, right, either I have full or, right, again, they're all similar. They make slightly different changes. If I go ahead and I could make my voxel size smaller than this, but my geometry is going to start going crazy pretty soon, right? And so what I really want to do is, because this is so dense, I actually want to select my random field, and I am going to make that scale a little bit bigger, but I want to show you some of the other settings on the random field as well while we're here. So the scale is close to 100%, right? If I can increase the scale, right, my noise is essentially going to get bigger, right? So I have larger interconnected blobs working together here, right? So I can scale that up. I can change the type of noise. By default, it's purlin. I could switch to blistered turbulence, which is going to kind of change the shape and character of that noise. I can adjust the space as well, right? So currently it's contained within the field, but if I go to global, that basically just really rapidly changes the scale of the noise, right? So 200% looks a lot bigger there. And then there's the relative scale, like you would have. You can actually animate all of this. And we're not going to worry about color shift right now. There are some other types of noise here in the random mode. We're going to leave that where it is, but you can just experiment with like what do some of these other types of noise look like when you've got them turning this into 3D noise. Now you'll notice if you use Voronoi 1, maybe 2 as well, but 1 for sure, right? You get something that looks a lot like Swiss cheese, right? You actually get these nice pockets of emptiness that come into the shape. And so we've got our fog smooth. Let's look at some of the other options that we have in terms of how we can adjust this setting. I'm going to smooth this out just a little bit more. Now I want you to notice that when I smooth this, you'll see that like I lose, you know, some details and some holes. I'm on medium. Let's go to Gaussian. You can see how blobby that becomes, and you can see how much more porous this is. Right, and this is with it set to min. If I set to multiply, you know, I get a slightly different change. If I go to max, that's not going to work. But really, it's min or multiply seems to work the best right now. Normal is not going to do anything for me. So I'm going to leave this at multiply. If I change the order of these things, so I can just pull, if I pull this torus up, right, and then change the order, I basically get the same result, right? This is a very similar result to what I had before. You know, I can, at this point, increase this, but again, I'm going to hit those edges of that field, right? So I've got this really beautiful noisy object, and that's just using the fog smooth. Let's look at some of the other filters. So I'm going to turn fog smooth off. I'm going to click and hold. I'm going to do fog multiply, and I'm just going to go ahead and do some multiplying. I don't see any real changes happening on the surface of this with this setup. If I pull this down in the order somewhere else, nothing happens. Some of these are new and I haven't actually used them before. Fog curve looks like it makes minor changes, but maybe if you add the curve option in here. Oh, there we go. Right, so this allows me to actually use, that's really cool. This allows me to use this curve to adjust the density of the fog in different parts. So you can see, right, depending on where I place these points and how I move them, I get very different, very, very different outcomes that are pretty beautiful and amazing. Right, so you can, there's a lot to play with here. And then on top of that, I can always run a smooth, which if I pull the smooth up above the fog, there we go, right, then I'm having the type of interaction that I would like to have, which is where this has is impacting that shape, right? When I had it the other order, right, it's doing these weird, it's basically creating a shell around the space, because what it's doing is it's smoothing the torus on the random field. If I pull this down to the random field first, right, I'm going to have, again, a much different result than I would otherwise. And if I uncheck the curve, you can kind of see what happens. But if I pull this up on top of everything, then it's going to smooth that final geometry that the curve creates. Something else you can do is once you volume mesh something, and this is going to probably destroy my computer, but you can also drop it into a subdivision surface. So I can actually put this whole thing in a subdivision surface to further smooth the geometry. And you'll see that, you know, in a lot of this, it's still a little bit lumpy and pixelated, and so I might need to go ahead and in my volume builder increase the strength of that smooth a little bit. And I might, if I use the subdivision surface, I might want to increase the number of polygons that are being applied to this. Oh, and that's going to take forever to render. Hopefully it works. Right. So it's done some things. It's still a little bit sketchy looking. I don't know quite why it's being as twitchy as it is. I'm going to go ahead and turn that subdivision surface off because that's not really helping me. And then the voxel range threshold, right? This is something else that it doesn't take much, but you can get a little bit more smoothing out of this. I went down to 46%, but even if I was at 48 or maybe 51, it might help me smooth some of these things out a little bit. Okay, so this is another way that you can use fields to influence and create really unique geometry using the volume builder.